Thank you, Brad, and thank you everyone for taking the time to be here with us today. Before we begin, we'd just like to give additional thanks to all the companies who took the time to participate in our study. Hae-Song and I valued your insight, appreciated your sincerity, and genuinely enjoyed the discussions we had and are eager now to share our findings concerning the future of remote work with you all today. Our agenda for today is as follows. We'll begin by providing a brief overview of our research sample, then move on to the crux of our presentation, which is divided into 3 buckets: pre-COVID, during COVID, and post-COVID. Lastly, we'd like to conclude with some final takeaways and questions to consider moving forward. As of today, we have interviewed and analyzed the data for 17 companies across various industries. In terms of company size, we spoke with companies both small and large. Some companies had workforces of approximately 3,000 employees, while others had north of 250,000 employees. Next, workforce composition differed across industries, and who was deemed an essential employee followed suit. Lastly, the companies in our sample had disparate business impacts as a result of the pandemic. Some did very well and were able to experiment more at this time, while others struggled and view the next steps through the lens of cost reduction. We will now shift to the pre-COVID phase of our presentation and focus on how companies viewed remote work prior to the onset of the pandemic. Our research found that prior to COVID-19, remote work was clearly the exception and not the norm. As you can see from the pie chart on the left, approximately 2/3 of the companies indicated that remote work was minimally prevalent in their organizations, and only 12% felt that their companies had widespread remote work. The pie chart on the right focuses on flexible work offerings, and as you can see, almost every company we spoke with shared that they had some type of formal flexible work policy arrangement. Building off this idea that employees needed to go through a formal process to leverage remote work, our research found that remote work often came with set criteria for employees. Number 1 on that list was manager comfort. Is a manager comfortable evaluating an employee without being able to see them throughout the day? This is obviously a skill managers have built over the past 9 to 10 months, but prior to the pandemic, managers had close to no experience executing on this. Secondly, like many other benefits, performance is a key factor. Employees had to be considered high performers, and this really hits on the idea that remote work was an opportunity that was earned as opposed to given based off the employee's need. Next, the nature of the role was a key factor in this decision. Where will the employee be able to do the best work? If the company or manager felt it was the office, then that employee would not be able to take advantage of a remote work offering. Finally, companies were more likely to offer remote work in order to attract or retain key talent to their organization, which again hits on the idea that remote work was the exception and not the norm. Prior to COVID-19, how did senior leadership view remote work? Our research found that 65% of senior leadership teams were strongly against remote work. These companies had strong relational cultures that was bolstered through their time in the office and weakened their confidence in remote work. Not surprisingly as well, 47% of the companies we spoke to explicitly indicated that they felt the purpose of the office was to allow for in-person collaboration and drive innovation through informal conversations. Of course, prior to COVID-19, collaboration and innovation were thought to be significantly threatened by remote work. Because of these perceptions, the culture of most companies was not aligned to hybrid work. Companies fell into 3 buckets along our hybrid work continuum: office-oriented, remote work option, and proactive. 29% of the companies described their orientation for the office as the primary location where the culture could be shared and where employees could do their best work. 53% of the companies were further along in terms of their comfort with hybrid work arrangements. It provided formal, flexible work arrangements, and hybrid work was occurring within some pockets of the workforce. Finally, 18% were proactively transforming their organizations to be better suited for hybrid work. Now, as the data shows, 82% of companies we spoke with did not support an integrated hybrid work model in their organizations. But for the remaining companies, what did it mean to be proactive? Number 1, senior leadership was changing their narrative around remote work and developed confidence that productivity would not waver in this setting. Number 2, these companies adapted the way they thought about work and transformed their cultures to focus on results as opposed to processes. In other words, they valued the work that was completed as opposed to where or how that work was getting done.
So next, we will transition into the during COVID phase and discuss the organization's experiences and learnings after going remote and how they compare to their work cultures pre-COVID. So first, we asked our CAHRS partner companies on what they thought were the biggest or most salient benefits to come out of this grand experiment with remote work. And so here's a bar graph listing the benefits in order of frequency mentioned. So number one, almost every company we spoke to mentioned this increase or maintenance in employee productivity. And common reasons being the lack of commute, and on the flip side, this complete blurring of home and work boundaries. But this benefit goes hand in hand with benefit number two, which is this changing organizational leadership belief around remote work. And as Ralf just mentioned, in pre-COVID times, one of the most biggest oppositions to remote work came from this belief from senior leadership, really, that productivity would go down if employees went remote. And what COVID-19 has done is essentially has acted as a big myth buster. The other one we'd like to touch on in the top three here is the acceleration of transformation. So changes that would otherwise have been very slow or incremental, requiring like pilot programs or a lot of buy-in from senior leadership, these all happen very sudden and were embraced by all the workforce overall. So this, of course, involves things like technological adoption and processes. So the adoption of Zoom or Microsoft Teams overnight, but it also includes things like everyone agreeing to collaborate on Google Docs instead of printing out a million different work documents, showing that sometimes the biggest changes come from these small behavioral changes. But beyond technology, which is the obvious transformation we think of, there are also things like spinning up of new cross-functional teams or team structures, and even things like digital sales enablement strategies suddenly becoming really successful. And this strategy would have been something on the back burner for a lot of our organizations. And what we see is this comfort with making quick decisions and taking risks as companies had to adapt really, really quickly. But if we were to boil these benefits down into a key theme or a key benefit, it's that COVID-19 has become a catalyst for cultural change by shattering these assumptions companies held about themselves. So here on the left is the before. So these are the things we heard frequently in our interviews about the beliefs companies had about their productivity, their ability to move fast and take risks, and on how work or performance was really defined or measured in their organizations. And now in the during here in the middle bucket here is how companies have busted these myths about themselves. So they found alternative ways of working effectively. They found that they can actually make decisions pretty quickly and effectively as well. And they found that, as Ralf mentioned in the pre-COVID time, that they don't have to measure work in the amount of time the employee spends in the office or how present the employee is to the manager, but actually based on the impact and the result of the work itself. And the result of this to the right here is actual positive cultural transformation. So increase in trust between the managers and the teams and closer bonds, a sense of flattened hierarchy as more and more people are sort of empowered to make decisions and take risks, and overarching changing perspective on what work and what good performance means. And now the challenge for this will be for companies to try to maintain these positive changes even after the pandemic ends and not just let it atrophy away because people are back in the office. Now on the challenges side, here are the most frequently mentioned challenges of remote work. Unsurprisingly, burnout and work-life balance was at the very top. And this is the flip side of increased productivity. Every company that mentioned, yeah, employees have gotten really more productive. We saw great business continuity. They also mentioned, but hey, this is not sustainable. The blurred home work boundaries, the realities of having to maintain business continuity and performance through the pandemic, this has obviously taken a tremendous toll. And the other three we will get a little bit deeper into in the next slide here. So if we do a deeper dive into those other three challenges, once again, the common theme seems to be around organizational culture, or more specifically, what happens in the workplace and in person that is so critical to company culture and just can't be substituted or augmented with technology. So those three areas were called out as three of the most critical areas where in-person interaction or physical workspace are really beneficial. One, because the physical office and in-person interactions themselves are such a tangible and dynamic representation of company culture. And two, because the physical office space allows for this organic and serendipitous connections to take place, which oftentimes leads to these new ideas and seeds for innovation. And there's a lot of empirical research that suggests this as well. Now, what we see in the before all these rich interactions, what happened during COVID, all of this has become, yet another Zoom meeting and something that has to be very intentionally scheduled and thought of beforehand. The long-term consequences of all of this is to the right here. And all of these were mentioned by our partner companies as factors that they were taking into consideration as they start to make decisions on what hybrid work looks like in the future, because these are serious human capital risks, serious risks when it comes to people and culture that we just don't have clear answers yet to right now. Now, of course, companies also responded to these challenges in creative ways. But what this graph shows more than anything is how much weight and responsibility we've placed on the managers to ensure the success of remote work and organizational bonds. So almost every company put a lot of focus on enabling and developing their managers, such as providing playbooks, providing formal training and coaching opportunities, but also a lot of informal peer-to-peer learning as well, so that managers could learn from one another with all these real-time unprecedented circumstances on what it meant to manage a remote team effectively. And this highlights that this pandemic has really called upon managers to evolve from a good manager of work to become a good leader of people. And this involves developing perhaps new competencies around trust and communication. And what this also shows is that managers were more critical than ever to role modeling and transmitting the company culture to their teams, because all our employees who might have felt that company culture from interacting with other employees in the workplace were now perhaps more siloed, with their key connection to the office and the company being through their managers. Now, most companies also bolstered their benefits and offerings, and these fell approximately into three buckets: the ergonomic home office benefits, health and wellness benefits, and working parent benefits. Of course, there being this keen recognition that working parents were perhaps more impacted than any other group through the pandemic. And so many companies were aware that these benefits or their responses to COVID and providing for their employees were going to be a big strategic move for the future, as it would become a big brand differentiator for themselves in the market for prospective employees. And lastly, companies also sought to limit meeting times quite a bit, recognizing that, when everything becomes yet another Zoom meeting, that does have a tremendous toll on burnout and stress. So companies would set things like no meeting days or really try to limit maximum meeting times. Now, we also asked what data companies were using to measure and inform the remote work decisions. So most companies were using formal channels of gathering employee feedback, such as focus groups or surveys. And we saw the frequency of these surveys range from twice in the past 6 to 8 months to quick pulse surveys every day, to make sure that they were gathering critical data on employee needs and what employees needed to not only be productive at work, but really feel mentally well and safe. Many companies were also directly measuring business metrics and performance metrics. After all, this is how so many companies were able to note that productivity did not go down as a result of remote work. But a couple of things to note here is that with this increase in employee voice and just this flood of employee data, that HR's responsibilities in advocating for and amplifying employee needs greatly increased. And that organizations were really using this increase in real-time employee data to respond quickly, not only with one-size-fits-all responses for employees, but programs or policies that targeted different employee groups. So here again, HR had to show a remarkable level of agility and adaptability here. And companies were using this data to immediately sort of measure the effectiveness of their responses and iterate. So we see this increase in a data-driven approach overall. Companies that benchmarked with other organizations also seem to recognize that, again, their responses to COVID and their future remote work strategy will continue to be a brand differentiator and help them compete for talent against competitors or similar companies.
We'd now like to double click on the post-COVID section of our presentation by focusing on how companies can manage the now while also beginning to prepare for the future. In terms of short-term return to work, many companies have phased employees back into the office. If you are considering phasing employees as well, here are some things to consider. Number one, feasibility based on geography. Some employees have opted to relocate during this time and may not be near a company site. Number two, once again, the nature of the role is critical. Does this employee need to be in person to do their best work? Companies are focusing on the quality of work right now, as opposed to where it gets done. And number three, in terms of actual implementation, companies have opted for rotations among employees, i.e. a blue team comes in 1 week and a red team will come in the following. Finally, above all, companies have stressed to their employees that as of right now, returning to the office is completely voluntary and is dependent on employee comfort and what works best for them based on their personal situations. So 9 months into this mass exodus from the office, we'd like to highlight some key takeaways for managing return to work. Number one, if you are opting for a voluntary return to the office, at least for the time being, be cognizant of the unintended pressure this may be causing employees. Senior leaders coming into the office may cause a trickle effect down to managers, which could place unnecessary pressure on employees to model this behavior as well. Number two, it's not hyperbole to say that the role of HR has never been more critical. The function has been thrust into leadership positions and job responsibilities that were not known prior to the pandemic. Companies shared that it is critical for HR to be in absolute lockstep with their business leaders and connect them with the resources they need to be successful. Additionally, HR must continue to be the cultural stewards for their organizations and model the behaviors they'd like to see, as well as continuing to be conscious and communicating the employees' pain points to the business and senior leadership. Lastly, HR must ensure that the learnings from this time are not lost by being a key driver of intra-organizational learning. Number three, in terms of a communication strategy, many companies have not formalized this step yet, but for the ones who have begun communicating next steps to employees, they have been transparent about how they view the future role of the office, whether the goal is to bring everyone back to the office or that the company will be embracing some form of hybrid work in the future. Companies should consider the impact this new strategy has on its employees. Lastly, as companies think about moving forward, there's still so much work to be done and much more to learn, but our research found that companies are trending towards some type of centralized policy around flexibility that provides guardrails for local teams based on legal and regulatory requirements, but will also allow for localized implementation based on employee, cultural, and of course, business needs.
So where are we at the end of all this? So that was sort of the short-term return to work policies and thinking, but what about the long term? From the very outset of this project, Ralph and I were interested in seeing how companies would move in their stance on hybrid work pre versus post-pandemic based on their learnings throughout this pandemic period. To bring this graphic back from earlier on the presentation in the pre-COVID phase, we see that overall, 84% of companies had a very strong in-office culture where remote work was allowed, but was very much an exception to be used to acquire or retain key talent or as a privilege to be earned. And when we ask companies how they envision hybrid work post-pandemic, the overall breakdown now looks a little bit more like this. So 35% of companies noted a strong desire to return to the way things were before the pandemic, perhaps increase flexibility in remote work policy here and there, but overall still, let's return to the way things were orientation. But for the majority of the companies, so 65% of the companies here, it does seem like the pandemic will have a lasting transformation. A lot of these companies mentioned the pandemic has been like a Pandora's box because it has shown everyone a new way of working. And more importantly, it has changed employees' desires and expectations around remote work because the pandemic has shown that, yes, we can work remotely and successfully. So the companies in this 30% bucket may not be committing to massive organizational transformations quite yet, but these are the companies that are noting that remote work will now go from an exception to an expectation. The remaining 35% of companies here have begun to commit to making changes to enable long-term hybrid work, becoming an organizational norm. So what are these companies in the 35%? So the ones that have begun to take the plunge, what are they doing? And what are their key incentives for doing so, which is in the bottom green part here. So number one, some of these companies are committed to changing the physical space. So a couple of these companies have already moved office locations to smaller or less costly locations, or have begun to commit to making changes in the workplace by increasing co-working spaces and decreasing private office space, and predicting their real estate cost savings or decrease in footprint based on that. Number two, some of these companies are beginning to run pilots to test hybrid work arrangements, especially when certain team members are remote and certain team members aren't. And the intention of this is to start gathering long-term data on the sustainability of hybrid work and its impact on employee engagement, team engagement, and productivity. And lastly, some companies have begun to recategorize all their jobs based on how much in-office time they need. And what this allows companies is that it allows them to become no longer geographically limited when they go out to acquire talent, because they no longer have to think about the employee's proximity to an office. And this ultimately allows for a larger transformation of the workforce. So for example, one of the companies we interviewed, for example, had turned a large team of their customer support employees from being entirely in the office to entirely remote. And this will stay after the pandemic. So in the media and in the press, I think we're constantly seeing very like bombastic declarations from companies saying, we are going to be all remote from now on. But in reality, companies are taking a lot more measured and a lot more nuanced approach. And that's for a very good reason. So overall, there's a keen recognition that what's working now is working now because of two factors. A, because we have no choice but to make it work. And B, because we believe this is for the short term. And it's easier to let's make do with what's working now when we believe that this is not going to be sustainable or this doesn't have to be forever. So in other words, it's hard to apply what's working now and just project them into the future and make all these decisions based on current data. So our interviews also made it very clear that the best form of hybrid work will be unique to each organization and each organization's culture and structure, and most importantly, what the senior leadership ultimately believes. So as a closing note, we actually wanted to capture these key questions the companies we interviewed are asking themselves, because we thought these are the most salient questions that we recommend asking yourself and your organizations as well, as you think about remote work, not just in the next 3 to 6 months, but for the next 3 to 5 years and even longer. So what we see is that there's no one size fits all answer, and there's a lot of uncertainty here. But if there's one thing that's become incredibly apparent from this research, it's that HR is taking the lead in asking these questions for the organization and the leaders. And that, as Ralf mentioned, HR has really taken on a role like never before, from becoming experts in public health overnight or digital transformation, but also to becoming the voice for unheard employees and becoming the vision setter for the future of work in your organizations. And for that, Ralf and I would really like to thank all our participants for making the time to partake in this research project, and for all of you for attending the session. So thank you. And on that note, we will turn over to any questions that you might have.
Great, thanks Hae-Song and Ralf, great presentation. We have had some questions come in, and for those of you that haven't submitted any yet, please do, and we'll try to field those as we go along. One of the questions that was raised is kind of this question of, what do employees want going forward? What are companies hearing from their employees? And this person notes that, prior to the pandemic, most of their employees work full-time in the office, but in a recent survey, they found that only about 10% of employees really express a desire to come back full-time to the office. Most are looking for more of a hybrid arrangement like you talked about, or even a full-time kind of remote work arrangement. So just kind of curious in terms of how that lines up with maybe what the companies you talk to are hearing from their own employees.
I would say this is definitely representative of the companies we spoke with. Employees like the flexibility of remote work. They genuinely have been a fan of this shift to a hybrid work arrangement. And we feel strongly in saying that hybrid work is here to stay, and companies have to make a decision based on what's best for their employee populations, their structures, and their organizations, like Hae-Song mentioned.
Yep. I do think employees do miss the workplace for specific reasons, such as they do want to see their colleagues, or they do find the value in coming in for these types of whiteboarding sessions, or sessions where you know that like a 2-hour Zoom meeting just isn't the most effective way. But as Ralph mentioned, overall, there's definitely this increased desire for remote work and hybrid work.
Great. So somewhat related question, you talked about a number of different sources of data that companies are using to inform their decisions. And the question was, how are companies kind of weighting, that data, assuming they're collecting across different sources, and in particular, again, weighting kind of what they're hearing from their employees versus maybe what they're seeing in the performance data, what they're hearing from managers. So kind of how much is that employee feedback maybe driving their thinking and strategy going forward?
I do think from the companies we spoke to, the employee voice is being the most heavily weighted, especially, and they're using the employee voice to really guide the remote work strategy moving forward. So it's a balance of that, and then also looking at the business continuity and employee performance. Because if we see a steep decline in employee performance or business based on remote work, then there's a clear need to just sort of recalibrate. But we did see that companies were using the employee voice the most heavily.
That makes sense. Another question that just came in, did you see any best practices surrounding managing new hires? I think this has been a major challenge for companies, thinking about how do we onboard new employees in this entirely kind of virtual environment. So did you kind of hear any kind of practices that companies were using that they found effective in that regard?
Yeah, and this is definitely a prevalent issue right now, and one that's atop of many companies' minds. I think one that immediately stands out is really deciding what's best for that new hire with the team. So if the team feels that it would really benefit the new hire if everyone was in the office for a month, 2 months, 3 months, whatever the team decides, being flexible to that new hire's needs and adjusting accordingly.
Oh, so yes, this is for the long term, especially if the hybrid work approach is to become more of a reality. In the short term, what we saw is that number one, as Ralph mentioned, every single company we spoke to mentioned onboarding new talent is a key challenge we have right now. But more importantly, it seemed like the biggest thing companies were doing was to make sure that new employees knew how to connect with the right stakeholders. So even providing like a very intentional list of, hey, here's all the people you should speak with, not just for your work, but to understand company culture overall. And there seemed to be a much more intentional approach from companies to set the new employee up with potential mentors or other leaders who would be a really great role model or a transmitter of what that company's culture is all about. So definitely a lot more intentional approach to match the employee up with these elements of company culture and strong leaders.
That makes a lot of sense, where you might think over time, if they're in the office, eventually they're going to connect with everybody they need to. In this environment, you really need to kind of orchestrate that much more purposefully. That makes sense.